Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan here in Tokyo. I'm Anthony Rowley, a former president, and I'll be moderating today's session, which is the latest in what we call our deep dive events, in which we ask panels of experts to give their views on matters of current interest. And today's subject certainly is a matter of current interest. We're talking about the United States and Japanese economies in the wake of key elections. And we have two experts with us here this morning, and I'll introduce them right away. To my right is Paul Sheard, who is, among other things, author of the Wall Street Journal best-selling book, The Power of Money. He's also a former Harvard Senior Fellow and former chairman of S&P Global. And to my left is Jesper Koll, who's Global Ambassador and Expert Director at the Monex Group, an investment committee member of the Japan Catalyst Fund. Those are very brief introductions. I hope they'll excuse me, but we want to get as much discussion in as we can. So here we are, between two elections. You might say between a rock and a hard place. The rock is the shock, if you like, of what happened at the weekend with the Japanese election, which appears to have left Japan rudderless politically in a sea of uncertainty. And the hard place is the drama or possibly trauma of the US presidential election, which is due to take place on November the 5th. So I won't say any more. I'll invite first Paul Sheard to give his remarks. And if I may just tell everyone, if you have a mobile phone, please put it on manner mode or switch it off as a courtesy to our guests. So, Paul, if you would lead off, please.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and it's a great pleasure to be back at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan and sharing the podium with my two old friends. Last few times I've been on the podium, it's been virtual from New York, so particularly happy to be able to be here in this very eventful week. But I will be flying back tomorrow to the United States and casting my vote on Tuesday. I'll be voting in person on the day, which is becoming increasingly unusual in the United States. So yes, it is very interesting times. I'll focus a little bit more on the US, and then I think Jesper might focus more on Japan, and we'll segue in that direction. So I want to touch briefly my introductory comments on kind of three issues. One is, I don't think you can avoid a little bit of preview of who is likely to win the US presidential election. Put my 2 cents in there. Then I want to say just a few words about kind of how to think about the significance of the presidential election for the economy. How significant is it really for the economy? And then thirdly, I'll say a little bit about very subjective assessment of how I see the Trump policies versus the Harris policies. We'll find out next week, or maybe we won't find out next week, who is going to be the next president of the United States. So just on the first question of who looks likely to be the president, I think the cat is kind of out of the bag now. The indications are that former President Trump is in a much better position. Looks like he may well be the next president, come back for a second term. What are the data points for that? One of the interesting things now is that we have these betting markets. And being an economist, I probably turn, first of all, to where are people putting their money, rather than what are they saying. And the betting markets seem to be indicating, well, particularly Polymarket is one that I tend to follow. I think it's probably the most common one. 65% chance of Trump winning versus 35%. So you have to be a little bit careful with the interpretation of these numbers, because 65 versus 35 sounds, wow, well, that's, looks like Trump. That is still, though, 1 in 3 for Harris. And, when you actually sitting there and watching election night coverage, which for sort of policy and political junkies is an adrenaline-charged affair, during the night, the probabilities that are being updated in real time as the votes come in swing around wildly from 10% up to maybe 100%. I think that was more or less 2016 for Trump. So from that point of view, that 65% may not last very long. Likewise for the 35%. But if you disagree, of course, the important thing for the presidential election is the electoral college. rather unique system that the US has. And so what really matters is the position in the battleground states, the swing states. And there are 6 of them in this election. The 3 ones that were sort of there from 2016, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And then, of course, because Trump lost Arizona and Georgia unexpectedly in 2020, they're 2 battleground states. And then Nevada is very much in play as well. Now, all of those 6 states Trump lost in 2020. And if he holds the states that he won in 2020, that starts with 232 votes. He only needs to pick up 3 of those 6 states, and pretty much will get him over the line. The betting markets have him at the moment ahead in 4 of the states. It was 6 up until a couple of days ago. Now Michigan and Wisconsin, I believe, are the 2. No, I think it's just 1 state. Michigan is just flipped to 51% for Harris in terms of the betting market. All the other 5 states are sort of well in the Trump column. The other way to look at it is to look at what are the polls saying, and I tend to look at the Real Clear Politics average. Again, they have nationwide, which doesn't mean very much, but it's kind of interesting to compare with 2020 or 2016. Trump a little bit ahead, 0.4 percentage points. But in 2020, Biden was 7.5 percentage points ahead. In 2016, Clinton was 1.7 percentage points ahead. So that speaks to the fact that, at least for the last couple of elections, Trump has outperformed his polling. Now, there's a question mark about, will that regularity hold this time? We'll have to wait and see. But if it does hold, the fact that, in all the battleground states except Michigan and Wisconsin, he's ahead in the Real Clear average. But if you look at somewhere like Michigan, he's down 0.5%. But Biden was up 8.6% in that poll at the same time last time, and yet it was a very, very close election. So again, there are biases in the poll. Having said all of that, you can go through these numbers till you're blue in the face, but there's only one poll that matters, and that's the not so much the poll on election day, but the actual voting that takes place. And there's a big but, which is really the election will be determined by turnout. This is such an important variable, and which party can get the vote out, particularly in those marginal swing battleground states. And it's going to be very interesting again after the numbers come in to kind of go through this stuff, because last time, 2020, the turnout rate went up dramatically, 6.5 percentage points, which was sort of unusual because it was a COVID election and there were lockdowns and whatnot. But there was a huge change in the method of voting, and mail-in voting went up by about 24 percentage points, from 25% to about 43 percentage points, so up about 19 actually. And in-person, on-the-day voting went down by 24%. So major swing. So 2 things happened in 2020. There was a major change in the method of voting, and also the turnout ratio went up, and then it was an extremely close election. The margin in 3 states that really determined the election was about 40,000 votes. That would be Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. In other words, on the day in 2020, if about 20,000 people who turned out and voted in those 3 states for Biden had switched to Trump, Donald Trump would not be running this time. He would be finishing his 2nd term. It's that close. So that's why, these turnout numbers can just swamp all of the sort of prior predictions. So we'll just, again, have to wait and see how all that plays out. Let me move on to the second point. I just want to briefly touch on as well. What does all this mean, analytically, if you like, for the economy, which is really the key question today. Yeah. And I just want to be, perhaps douse a little bit of cold water on proceedings, because it's, as an economist following economies and markets, as a general rule, the kind of interest that there is, or focus that there is on politics, on geopolitics, even major market events like a stock market crash sometimes, doesn't really make its way to the economy and move the economy in a very big way. So it takes a lot for politics to move the economy. The US economy is a $29 trillion economy. It's a huge juggernaut. And it's basically a market economy. And it's very difficult for policymakers to move it. And particularly when you think about this, it's always a little bit kind of almost humorous when we get to the presidential election season, which starts immediately after the prior presidential election. Mm-hmm. They'll start talking about 2028 pretty quickly, after January 20th. The way that the media presents things, the way that the presidential candidates in the primaries and then in the presidential runoff they speak as if they're kind of like an economic dictator. They're going to do this, they're going to do that. And of course, there are many different sort of gates that you have to go through from what the candidates are saying in the campaign to how that is actually, if at all, going to influence the economy. First of all, you have the important point of how does a successful presidential candidate translate into policy implementation what they've been saying in the election campaign. Now, I think Trump he's a little bit easier in that regard because he tends to, if he says something, he will tend to follow through on that. But even so, he's going to be a busy man if he becomes president. There's a lot of distractions, a lot of moving parts. Events can often overwhelm a presidency. So, one has to already kind of discount a little bit what the candidates are saying versus what they're going to try to do in office. But then let's not forget that this is not just a presidential election. This is also a congressional election. 1/3 of the Senate is up. The whole of the House of Representatives turns over, or it's up every 2 years by design of the Founding Fathers. And so there are two ways of getting presidential policy into effect, into implementation. One is it may require, and often does require, legislation. So you've got the Congress to contend with. And bear in mind that Trump, although he's the leader of the Republican Party, is not necessarily beloved by many of the establishment Republican politicians, particularly in the Senate. A little bit more following in the House. And on many issues, it's more like Trump versus the establishment rather than Trump, the Republican, versus the Democrats. Bear that in mind. So you've got to get through the Congress. The other avenue is executive actions. So when it comes to, for example, border issues, when it comes to tariffs is one element that the president does have under his control. And by the way, I think one of the reasons that Trump is talking about tariffs so much is that somebody he found out, dirty little secret, you don't need Congress to get the tariffs through. You can do it yourself. I mean, he maybe learned that the last time around. So he thinks, okay, this is something I can control. I'm going to use that as a lever. So executive orders will be coming thick and fast as well. And we've got into the situation in the US now that even if the president doesn't have the power under the Constitution to do something via executive action, they'll often do it anyway and just wait for the litigation to come. And that can take years to get through to the Supreme Court and actually rule on the constitutionality. Meanwhile, you're actually implementing the policy. I mean, Biden has done this, for example, with student debt relief. Went up to the, they knew it was not constitutional the way it was being done, went to the Supreme Court, it was knocked back, but then they do it again in a slightly different format. So litigation, increasingly being called lawfare, is going to come into play again. I think particularly if Trump wins, there'll be a lot of litigation, a lot of sand being thrown into the wheels. Then you have the next stage is, okay, you get through that, you've got to get through the implementation by the bureaucrats and the officials. Well, one of Donald Trump's mantras, has been drain the swamp. It talks a lot about the deep state. And now he's talking about appointing Elon Musk, as if that guy is not busy enough to be the cost cutter in chief, the person who's going to come in and take the axe to the federal bureaucracy. So, even if Trump tries to get stuff through, he may run into some a little bit of implementation friction as well. And then you get to the economy. Even if the policies are put into place, how will they impact the economy? And again, I just come back to the point that the US economy is very dynamic, it's market orientated, it has, these very significant economic power centers, if you like, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Madison Avenue, and et cetera, which will not necessarily just jump when the politicians say jump. They may have their own ideas about what to do. Take tariffs, for example. I mean, it's very easy to say we'll impose tariffs, but what many economists, I think, would point out is if you do large tariff increases across the board, the exchange rate is likely to respond. The market, that is, will respond. Probably the dollar will strengthen, offsetting much of the tariff. I don't think Donald Trump understands the economics of that. It's a little bit kind of obscure, perhaps, but that is a major issue to contend with. Let me then. How are we going for time? Okay, I've got a few minutes left.
Okay, in 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Let me then talk perhaps the more interesting issue, which is, get through all of that. What would it mean in terms of policies being implemented or trying to be implemented between Trump and Harris? And here I'll be very, very subjective. Broad brush. Obviously, Trump would be more pro-business, pro-deregulation. Harris would be more activist, regulation, bigger government versus small government. That's a bit of a cliche, but I think that would be the overall kind of tone of the situation. Within that, energy, I think, would be a big area of deregulation by a second President Trump. Drill, baby, drill is his mantra. And I think under Harris, you would see a continuous regulation in that area, and of course, progressing of the Green New Deal or the green transition, energy transition. If you are somebody who is kept awake at night by worries about the looming climate catastrophe and crisis, Donald Trump will be your nightmare candidate. Generously speaking, he would probably leave much of that to the market to sort out, rather than, and he'd actively wind back many of the elements of the green transition, the Green New Deal, that are kind of in the pipeline. Doesn't like that kind of regulation. One interesting area where there's overlap is industrial policy. One of the things that's happened in the US is, again, when Trump came in 2016, it was all about make America great again, bring back the manufacturing jobs, and a very activist, I'll pick up the phone, I'll talk to CEOs, kind of an activist intervention in the economy and, through industrial policy. He didn't call it industrial policy, but you can think of it in those terms. In some ways, he stole the Democrats' clothes, or the clothes that the Democrats historically would have been wearing, which is to be worried about hollowing out and blue-collar workers and unions, etc. But in the Biden administration, we've seen the Democrats swing very much towards industrial policy as well, with the CHIPS Act, infrastructure bill, and so forth. And just industrial policy is back in fashion. It's kind of interesting from as somebody who cut my teeth as an economist in Japan, of course, and my doctoral thesis back in the 1980s was kind of very much around kind of industrial adjustment and what was going on with industrial policy, but more from the corporate side. I think Japan is sort of well placed to have some stature. We know a little bit about industrial policy. Maybe they should insert themselves a bit more in the debate. But anyway, that's an aside. On trade, I think Donald Trump stands to be more protectionist, but I'm a little bit less worried about the tariff issue, not for the reason I mentioned before so much as, I think that Trump is probably, at the end of the day, we won't see 100% tariffs across the board, and he's almost gives the game away. That I think he's playing game theory, that he thinks this is where he's got leverage. But in order for, what's important in game theory is for a threat to be credible, and for a threat to be, that will move the opponent. But for a threat to be credible, the people whose behavior you're trying to condition or change, Japan, China, Europe, whatever, have to believe that you really are prepared to carry through with your threat. So that's sort of, I think, again, Trump is a great sort of, prides himself at least on being his bargaining skills, and he can get any deal done. But I think he knows that little bit of trade, of game theory. So as an economist, I should be abhorring anything that looks like a tariff. I'm a little bit more comfortable. Border immigration, this is a big issue. I think if Trump wins, it'll almost be the single factor that will explain that will probably be the border issue. The numbers here, I mean, compared to economic data, I'll give you a bit of a headache trying to figure out the custom and border protection statistics. I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but and they have this concept of encounters at the border. That is, what they call undocumented immigrants. Used to be called illegal immigrants, but they might be trying to get asylum. Those numbers under the Trump administration, and they don't quite line up, sort of their fiscal year numbers rather than calendar year or presidential year numbers, but roughly speaking, totaled about 3 million encounters under Trump. Under the Biden administration, it's up to 10 million. And this issue, this idea that every state is a border state now, is kind of seeping through into the political psyche. And given that we're talking about, these elections being potentially determined by 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 votes. By the way, 2020, 158 million votes were cast. So this margin is rounding error. And so I think that border issue definitely, it'll be, build a wall, it'll be a lot of executive actions. Now, Harris is sort of pretending late in the game that the Biden-Harris administration and a new Harris administration would really get this border situation under control. But I think they don't really have a tremendous amount of credibility on that side of things. Tax is another area where there'll be differences. Several of the 2017 tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, actually sunset in 2025. So there's a tax battle looming sort of either way. But I think, again, broad brush, you could say that Harris will be more inclined to taxing the rich, whereas Trump will want to get those taxes made permanent and maybe even goes for some further tax cuts. And so there's a difference in sort of economic philosophy and also sort of distributional sort of philosophy there. Social Security, no one's going to touch that. I think we can skip that one. Just the last one I'll mention, looking at the clock here, I think I've done my 20 minutes, but anyway.
5 minutes to go.
Okay, he's very kind, moderator here, is on national security. Now, both, again, there's a broad consensus around a strong military, but there is one policy on which Trump stands out, and that is the Ukraine war. And this doesn't get much attention, but he's saying, and his vice president as well is very much in this camp, J.D. Vance. But Trump, says regularly in pretty much every rally and interview that he will end the Ukraine war on day one. He's actually changed his tune on that. He's now, for the last few weeks, been saying, no, he'll do it before day one. And he's been a big critic of the Ukraine war and the whole mess that, how do we get into this mess to begin with? Now, one way to think about this also is he doesn't want to become a Richard Nixon. If you're Trump, you've got an agenda. He doesn't like the Ukraine war to begin with, but he certainly would not want his administration to be hijacked by a major war, which continues to escalate, as we see, incrementally, bit by bit. It's been going for 2.5 years now. He doesn't want to be inheriting that. So if he does pick up the phone, he does have levers there as the president, the commander-in-chief. And, will he be able to put a stop to that war? Will he be able to broker some kind of ceasefire, some peace, freezing of the conflict? Who knows? But if he does, and he's the only politician, certainly the only candidate who's talking about doing this, that could be a geopolitical game changer, and of course that could have implications for food prices globally, for energy prices, for military expenditures, and so on. So that's something, it's sort of not talked about very much, but I would almost put that at the top of the list if you're looking for one single policy that actually could have an effect on markets, on the economy. That's it, and we should know pretty soon if he gets elected. It's not something that he's going to say, "Oh, I'll deal with that in 6 months' time." Like some of these issues, we'll know pretty soon. And again, we've seen Donald Trump do this. He met with Kim Jong-un a couple of times, unsuccessfully in the end. He's under constant attack for being easy on dictators and things like that. But I think that's water off a duck's back, and he'll be more interested in brokering a deal. And I think he wants the Nobel Peace Prize as well. I think it sort of irks him that Obama got one for not doing very much, and he did a lot of stuff, particularly around North Korea and no wars, etc., and he didn't get one. So that'll be a stretch, but he may be going for that as well. I don't know. Maybe I'll just leave off on Japan for the moment and come back to Japan.
Yes, okay. Maybe that's a good idea. And I mean, if you want to make just brief remarks.
Well, I mean, very briefly. Yeah. First of all, I guess I left Japan in 2006. I lived here for 17 years before that. Not as long as Jesper, I guess, these days. But so I've seen a lot of Japanese politics come and go, and it does feel very much like a déjà vu situation here. Very much reminiscent of the early to mid 1990s, when the LDP went into coalition with the socialists. We had Murayama Tomoichi as the prime minister. So there's that's going on. I have to kind of like be a little bit cynical and laugh a little bit when I hear about the dissolving the Habatsu. I've seen that movie before, and it doesn't take too long for them to come back as Benkyo-kai or study groups or, Konshin-kai and all sorts of things like that. So the more that Japanese politics, and then we have the money in politics theme, which seems to have just sort of sucked all of the oxygen out of the room here. Again, forgive me, but I come from the US. We know about money in politics. It has $1 billion handle on it. And I think that a lot of this money in politics kind of discussion here, which has kind of hijacked the political agenda, can be approached from a different angle. But that angle would be more about perhaps the whole political system here needs reform in the sense of opening up, and maybe we need more politics, more money in politics that would allow people to come into politics who would not be so beholden to the established interests. And the Seishu Seiji, I think, is a real problem in Japan. The fact that you have these political families and political dynasties. And I liken this to a company. Imagine if, pick a company, I won't name a company, but any large company. And imagine if that company said, we're only going to, or at least we'll have a preference, an orientation, a bias, to hire new graduates who have to be members of the family of existing employees of the corporation. If that was your talent pool as a company, you wouldn't last very long. And I think Japanese politics has become a little bit like that. So I think when we talk about political reform and money in politics, I think we need a slightly more out-of-the-box way of looking at it. And I think this has come through on, with Prime Minister Ishiba. I mean, he's obviously also third generation politician, but has not shown great political judgment and political leadership in taking over the prime ministership and immediately calling an election. And so those chickens have come home to roost very, very quickly. So what does this mean for the economy? Probably not an awful lot. Maybe it means that Kasumi Gaseki, the bureaucrats, are going to be a little bit more comfortable in the driving seat while there's political turmoil. Obviously, they need to keep the lights on and the country running. But one thing that did strike me in Prime Minister Ishiba's maiden policy speech to the Diet was there wasn't a lot of interesting new stuff around economics, and the words that I were looking for, and I did a word search, foreign workers, immigration, even kaigai, even overseas, even foreign, those words didn't really come up. So again, we don't know how long the Ishiba administration is going to last, but some of that new thinking about, how do we put the Japanese economy on a slightly different course, that thinking seems to have kind of died down a little bit under the current kind of administration. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But just, my bottom line on Japan is that, it will need to have a serious discussion about immigration, foreign workers, where they fit into the future of the Japanese economy. I think there's a lot of scope for Japan to have an immigration policy. I know it's a dirty word in Japan, a taboo word. Maybe we need to think of a new word. Foreign workers, there's now 3% of the workforce. Last 10 years, cumulative compound annual growth rate was about 11%. I think that trend is going to continue. So I'd rather see more focus on what should an immigration strategy, a foreign worker strategy that is very much in the national interests of Japan and tailored to this country's needs, maybe with a big focus on assimilation and preserving the social capital, the social fabric. What would that policy look like, rather than having all of this debate about money and politics?
Okay, stimulating. Thank you very much, Paul. Jesper, let's turn to you, please.
Paul, fantastic. I think the only thing that's missing is now we need to talk about Chinese politics. we've got the world covered. There's a lot in there, and just sort of a couple of remarks. Let me pick up from the American end, of your presentation, which I thought was excellent. In sort of my discussion with Japanese CEOs and Japanese policymakers, saying, look, actually, it doesn't matter whether it's Harris or whether it's Trump, because yes, there's a lot of little differences and there's a lot of kabuki in the way they proclaim things. But from a Japan perspective, America stands united. And it's the only thing that unites the United States of America, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, is the stance vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. And I think that whether you get President Trump or whether you get President Harris, I think, this in the name of national economic security, elaborating and building what Jake Schlesinger called, high fences, small yard, that the yard, in terms of what products and what industries America wants to, protect from competition with the People's Republic of China, I think that that's going to continue to grow. And whether that is electric cars, or whether that is specialized machinery, or whether that is some of the general material, I think from that perspective, I think that the course is laid out pretty clearly. And from a Japan perspective, the question is whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. And the original idea was fine if the head-to-head competition with made in China is going to be made easier because the Americans wave their protective wand. That was the idea. But the reality actually is, now that we're basically 2.5, 3 years into this, American national economic security focused anti-China policy, now that we're in this, you actually see that Japan's exports are hurting. They are hurting because of the machinery and machine tool sector, which is exactly what Japan thrives at, being blocked out in the name of national economic security, from supplying even to third countries like Indonesia or Egypt, which are part of the global south, with the Americans, ordering companies like Keyence, like Fanuc, to not supply their robots and machine tools because those factories in the global south could potentially be used as a pivot point to supply technology to the People's Republic of China. And as you know, if you look as an economist, it's always useful to sort of say, well, what has actually changed? And if you look at the Japanese balance of payments, what you notice is a dramatic change in the sense of that the exports of goods is not picking up. In fact, is about 10 percentage points below where it was last year, which should not be the case, given the fact that the yen is actually very weak. So Japan should have a nice competitive advantage. And when you look at global capital investment expenditure, that's actually very strong. So, Japan does supply capital goods. The yen is a weak currency. So Japan should be a beneficiary, but it isn't. And the reason, in my personal opinion, is the fact that, yes, made in China competition is now perfectly viable. not just in cars, but also in robotics or in machinery and machine tool industries, but also because of this American obsession and this American united front that in the name of national economic security, Japanese specialized machinery and machine tool companies are actually being excluded, from growing their global market share. So that's, I think, one thing. And I think, like I said, to the point, whether it's Trump or whether it is Harris, I doubt that this national economic security priority in the United States is going to change significantly, right? So that's, I think, one thing on the United States of America. The second point, and this, Paul, I would like to elaborate perhaps in the Q&A, is if you step back and this division, the feistiness with which the American, presidential election is now being fought, the divisiveness between the Republicans and the Democrats, right? Is this a symptom of larger socioeconomic forces in the United States of America? And, even if we look ahead in 4 years' time, right, is there going to be, dare I say, a more civilized debate in the United States of America, a more trustworthy debate amongst American politicians, right? Is, in other words, the leadership that the Americans are going to provide and the credibility that the Americans are going to provide to the global South, to Japan, to Europe, to really anybody, is that credibility going to be going up? And you're fully aware of the fact that when you look at opinion polls around the world, that the standing and the credibility that whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in the global South, that is attached to the leadership coming from the United States of America, that unfortunately is declined. So to me, it's a big question, right, whether these divisions of be it rich and poor, right, be it the tech-savvy, be it the not tech-savvy, right, be it the rural areas versus the coastal areas, whether there is actually the possibility of an inflection point towards greater unity. It's a big question mark, and that's obviously very, very important, particularly for Japan. Because if you're a Japanese leader, of course, the relationship with the United States of America is an incredibly important one and is obviously anchored at the end of the day in the security relationship. But the reality of Prime Minister Ishiba, right, coming off the cuff with this idea of an Asian NATO without consulting anybody and immediately annoying the Americans to no end. Because I think the last thing that American leaders want is a joint command structure in Asia Pacific. America wants to be boss in Asia Pacific, in my personal opinion. But the reality of Ishiba, whether we think it was a wise move or an unwise move, is a different discussion. I think that is it an expression of a sentiment within the Japanese elite? I think the answer is absolutely yes, right? That there is starting to be, a need to rediscuss, right? What is the actual relationship of Japan to the United States of America? And to be blunt, the reality that, again, may be a tactical mistake of Nippon Steel making an offer to buy US steel, right? Maybe a tactical mistake to do this during election year, but the reality of the ferocity of the rebuff from both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, at least in the initial stages, right? Certainly again sets off red lights, amongst the Japanese elite. How trustworthy, how credible is actually the US-Japan relationship going forward, right? Because obviously economic integration, right, is something that should be a good thing, but if in the name of national economic interest, right, American leaders cannot see that Nippon Steel transferring great technology, right? Specialized steel technology that, by the way, the Americans need at home to build specialized armored vehicles, right? Where they no longer have the ability, right? That being blocked so ferociously, I think is something, that is in international relations, in Japan's, global strategy, is something that needs to be discussed. Just as you pointed out, Paul, that internally the issue of immigration, is something that obviously is happening, but certainly at the political level, nobody is actually talking about. Which gets me perhaps a little closer to the Japan reality. And as you know, I'm always very bullish and optimistic on Japan. And in fact, for the last 4 years, I had this wonderful slide in my presentation, which is, Japan, what you need to know. And it's A, B, C. And it says ambitious, that the Japanese are ambitious, right? They win more gold medals than ever before, right? Pretty good, right? Japan, B, bastion of stability. And C, confident. And of course, the B thing now doesn't really quite work, because whether we like it or not, political leadership does matter. Yes, Japan has an elite bureaucracy that will hold a steady course. The probability of a government shutdown happening in Japan is close to nil. Right? Yes, whether Ishiba is going to be around in 2 weeks' time, in 4 weeks' time, in 3 months' time, I have no idea. Issun saki wa yami, right? 3 inches ahead, there is a little bit of darkness. But I think that the elite bureaucracy steering the ship, holding a steady course on both monetary policy and fiscal policy as well as regulatory policy, I think over a course of 6 to 12 months, we don't have to worry about Japan losing its economic track, right? Now, longer than a year, the bureaucrats do need direction. Because I, as a bureaucrat, I'm not going to commit my political capital, right, to a leader who I know is not going to be around in 6 months' time. So, from that perspective, having had the stability of very strong government, very strong political leadership since December 2012, when Prime Minister Abe ascended, we had a long period, right, of a very clear directive: get the economy going, get out of inflation, incentivize the private sector. These were the policies that Japan actually took, and where the bureaucrats, right, did use their capital to actually ensure that this would actually happening. Now that we've got, a probability of greater liquidity in the political world, right? The probability of the prime minister not being in office, right, by next summer is a high one, is a very significant one. So you and I, as a bureaucrat, we're not going to commit to making anything that this current cabinet is proposing to actually work, other than the day-to-day management, the little Kaizen improvement, right, that is needed in the administration of the country, where Japan is actually very, very good, right? Now, for 30 seconds, why this? I mean, Paul, we were there, we all thought, okay, well, fine, the LDP is going to lose, they're going to take a little bit of a drumming, but I mean, my God, the result certainly is at the worst end of expectations, right? That even with the Komeito, you don't have, you're short, 18 seats, right, of a majority in the lower house. Certainly a worse outcome than anybody expected. For 30 seconds, my opinion on why that is. Just as Paul pointed out, in the United States, when all, the commentariat, has done, when you actually look, it's probably immigration that is going to be the big issue in the United States of America. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think here in Japan, it is 2 issues. The first one is, yes, as Paul mentioned, money and politics, right? Which, remember, is an issue that Kishida exposed with his purge, right, of the Abe faction over the money scandal issues, right? So it was something that the LDP elders, in that case even the prime minister, the LDP president, brought to the fore of the debate, but never had a credible solution. And I totally agree with Paul. I mean, when you pay money, when is it? When you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, right? Sorry. In the sense, politics costs money. And it's embarrassing, by the way, it's fun. If you do the maths, Japan just did 2 weeks of national elections. You know how much that cost? It cost 2 weeks of Japan's national election, cost as much as the Democrats and Republicans spent in 3 days. It's quite incredible, right? So Japan, if you look for efficiency and return on investment, I think Japan is actually very good when it comes to politics. But, changing the metrics and changing the accountability and transparency of how are you to pay for your politicians, right? Is something where the LDP has failed, right? And as a result of that, the vote was a vote against the LDP rather than a vote, for Mr. Noda or for any of the other ones, right? So that's the first point. The second point, why did the LDP lose, is very simple. It is an economic issue, which is the reality of inflation. If you look at the voters, do you know that 65% of all the people voting are over the age of 65? If you're over the age of 65, you're effectively living off a pension, right? When you live off a pension, it does not matter whether the Nikkei is at 50,000 or at 20,000. It does not matter whether the shunto, the base pay, is at 2% or at 5%. What matters is inflation, because you're living off your pension income. And as you know very well, inflation is very high. It is absurd that we have Mr. Ishiba proclaiming he is the champion of the regional economies, when the reality is that we are paying the highest rice price ever in the history of post-war Japan. And this is not because the yen is weak. This is not because of imports. It's because of, excuse my technical term, an idiotic agricultural policy that the LDP has endorsed and implemented for the last 50 years, the set-aside policy, where actually the supply of rice production is being cut every year. So it's quite interesting, that you have these absurdities, but the reality of inflation cutting in. And this gets me to the single biggest policy issue that needs to be addressed, which is the reality that Japan's pension payments are lagging behind consumer price inflation. And this is because of something called the macro slide, very clever thing that the Abe team came up with, right? We can go into the details, but the reality is that last year, give or take, you had inflation of around 3%, but your pension payment increased by 1.9%. So why are the people angry? Number one, yes, the money politics, absolutely no question that that's a big issue in terms of the backlash against the LDP. But number two, the reality that, the pension payment system here is not indexed to inflation, and that Japan's anti-inflation policies, right, have actually failed, because all the income support measures that the LDP instigated in 3 supplementary budgets under Prime Minister Kishida, right? All the income support measures, basically did not work to actually reduce the increase in the cost of living, did not work to increase the purchasing power of the Japanese people. So that's, I think, where we are in terms of the political reality. So what is needed is credible pension reform, right, to actually ensure, right, that that the purchasing power of the pensioners does not get reduced, right? Now, obviously, I'm not a spokesman for the Ministry of Finance. They're probably going to withdraw my visa, when they hear me, saying these sort of things, right? So that, I think, is one point. The final point I want to make, which is a point that I make to investors, is that does this affect the changes, the positive changes that we have all observed over the last 4 years in Japan's corporate leadership? And the answer is no. I mean, my view is very simple. Japanese CEOs are not like LDP leaders. Japanese CEOs actually know what they're doing. They are focusing on investing, and on investing in projects, investing in companies, investing in people where the return is higher than the cost of investment, right? This is a big change that has actually happened. Is there a populist backlash here against these positive changes? The answer is no. Look at the fact that, one of the greatest consumer experiences in the world, which is going into a 7-Eleven supermarket, not supermarket, what are these things called? A conveni. And as you know very well, there is a Canadian company, right, who now wants to buy 7-Eleven. Is that an issue in the populace? Is this something, oh my God, the black ship are coming, the barbarians are at the gate, we need to fend it off? The answer is absolutely not. This is something that, well, if it makes sense, we trust that the governance at Seven & I Holdings is actually going to be good enough to actually work this out, which is a big change compared to where we were 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago. So the trust in the corporate governance of corporate Japan has massively improved, so that rationally dealing with and assessing a global takeover bid of one of the leading Japanese brands, right, is actually not stirring a national debate, is not stirring really any form of backlash, right? Which is very, very interesting that you've got this change. And so from that perspective, you know, in contrast to the LDP leadership, right, I think that the current generation of Japanese CEOs and Japanese board members, right, have actually evolved and have developed a strength that is going to continue to drive the Japanese economy forward. And whether that means 1.5% GDP growth, or whether that means 2% GDP growth, or 1% GDP growth, be my guest, the metabolism of corporate Japan, investing into more productive assets, shedding some of the non-productive assets, right? And most importantly, the Japanese CEOs continuing to increase their pay for performance within the corporate world. This is very important. We've got Rengo, you know, putting the first feeders into the ground, that next year's shunto is going to be 5%. I think, you know, more interestingly, you find that now the majority, not the majority, all of Japan's Keidanren member companies this year have hired more people mid-career than they hired during the graduate intake season. It's the first time ever in the history of the Keidanren, and you actually find that the average increase in pay, if I do switch jobs from one Keidanren company to the other Keidanren company, the average increase in pay is about 15%, which is very interesting that you've got the liquidity in the labor market picking up. You've got Japanese CEOs competing to attract the best labor, right? And that's a big change. So irrespective of the politics, irrespective, you know, of this political uncertainty that we do have to face here in Japan, I think that, you know, the leadership of the corporate sector, the leadership of the private sector is actually, you know, best in class, and is definitely, in my opinion, continuing to be very worthy, right, of continuing to invest in.
Okay.
Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you. Equally stimulating, not least the points you raised about the US-Japan relationship, the future thereof, I think. Okay, we'll turn to questions from the floor first, and then online. So first, do we have any questions from the floor? I would like to quickly raise one question for both speakers, if I may, and that is there something bigger playing out in Japanese politics than we have thought about so far? In other words, could there be a government of national unity that emerges from this situation we have at the moment, i.e. I'm talking about LDP plus the CDP, Noda and Ishiba. Could this even have been part of the calculations that went into the decision to call an election? Jesper first. By the way, Jesper has to leave, unfortunately, at 9:45, so directing questions to him first.
So, you know, this idea of a grand coalition, right? You know, I think, you know, is obviously an interesting one, but I find it extremely hard to believe. And the reason is that the LDP is feisty. You know, the young woman who lost against Ishiba in the runoff, Ms. Takaichi, right, you know, does have her eyes on the prize. And she's got very powerful, you know, backbones, right? Not just the Nippon Kaigi, right? But even in the rural areas, right? There's a very, very strong support mechanism. And, and I think, you know, and I think that, you know, the possibility of a stable, you know, grand coalition being formed And by stable, I mean something, whether tactically, this is a solution, that is going to be forged to pass the budget, in the spring of next year. I have no particularly strong opinion on that. But, as an investor, as somebody who thinks strategically, is this something that's going to be around next autumn? Right? I think the probability of that is very, very low. And the reason of that is exactly the reality of, within the LDP. I mean, what I thought was really interesting, Paul and I, we had this discussion 6 months ago. It's like, oh my God, the LDP's become boring, right? The LDP's become boring. There's nobody who wants the job. And all of a sudden, there's 9 people who actually want the job. All of them with different credentials, right? None of them, actually bad, from a leadership perspective. All of them with different ideas when you actually talk to these people and different passions that they want to follow. And so I think that now that Mr. Ishiba has, excuse me, technical term, screwed it up for the LDP, I think that those animal spirits within the LDP are going to get more and more feisty.
Okay. Paul, do you have a view on that, please?
There's not much I can add, but I mean, I think the question in my mind well, first of all, the way I look at the situation is my base case assessment would be that, the LDP and the Koll have been given a kick up the pants by the electorate. They will, cobble through, they'll cobble some kind of, if it's not a coalition, at least some kind of arrangement with, the smaller parties, and obviously that's being discussed at the moment, and they'll they'll get through this. And what the LDP is over the years, I mean, it's been going 1955, and it's only been out of power a couple of times. Has got it's a broad umbrella, it's a broad church. It's got and the 9 candidates means it's got a well diversified kind of pool of leaders inside the party. So I think probably we're sitting here in 2 or 3 years' time. There'll be a new prime minister. There'll be a new kind of banner with different policy proposals, etc. And they've regained their majority with the Koll coalition. That'd be my base case. But when you said, Anthony, is there something bigger going on? I mean, the question is, is this the beginning of that long-awaited move to a 2-party system in Japan? So, okay, Noda didn't quite make it this time, but could that be at the next election that we see a change in not a grand coalition, not the Rikken Minshito coming together with the LDP, but rather gaining power in their own right? I think that's still a steep mountain to climb.
Okay, thank you. All right, now, yes, Kurt, keep it as short as you can, please. Do you want the microphone there?
A very simple question. What does the exchange rate of the US dollar, Japan, and on the other side, the euro with Japan? What do they do to the Japanese overall situation? Thank you.
Look, it's great for companies and it's bad for the people. It's very simple. You can do the maths. You effectively end up with every 10 yen of yen depreciation adds back about 8 percentage points to listed companies' corporate profits, right? It's just a windfall. It's the nature of the game. Now, against that, every 10 yen of yen depreciation adds back about 0.3 percentage points, to the Japanese consumer price index in terms of imported inflation, right? Obviously depends on global food prices. It depends on, the overall terms of trade, but, that's roughly sort of the impact and the calculation that you actually have. And it's very interesting, right, that to Paul's point that he made earlier, which I think is just we are now wise people, right? And we've been around the block. We've had 3 or 4 global financial crises, observing it from Tokyo here. But politics is overrated in terms of as a yardstick or a guide pole for your investment decisions or for actually even forecasting the overall economies. Why do I say that? Because everybody is lamenting the demise of the United States as a credible, trustworthy, good leader. Oh my God, America is so divided, we can't trust it anymore. People talk about de-dollarization. When you look at the data, it's just not happening. The only thing that's something is the euro. Right? The value of the euro is absolutely collapsing in terms of international transactions as well as in terms of international reserves, right? And you also find, that, the dollar, right, as a very strong currency, right, against literally all currencies in the world is the predominant driver right now, right? And why is that? Because at the end of the day, the returns that are offered in the United States of America, right, continue to be extremely attractive. So everybody wants to invest. Again, I work for this retail broker, Monex Group, right? So we have these caravans every 6 weeks, going to Osaka, Fukuoka, and talking to Japanese retail investors. And they all want to know, right, when to buy Tesla, right? They're not interested in when to buy Mitsubishi. It's very interesting, right? And if you look at the NISA, right, these new savings accounts, where retail investors are now more active in the whole thing, again, you look at the data, 80% of the money goes outside. 20% goes inside, not bad, right? But it's only 20%. So it's quite interesting, that you've got the attractiveness of the United States of America, despite all this political noise, right? You find that the attractiveness of American capital markets, of American investment opportunities, right, is enormous. And here's a little hint. This is free of charge, right? The next big investment cycle in the United States is going to be real estate. Because you find that the commercial real estate market is obviously bombed out, right, because of work away from home, et cetera, and you will find that the moment it becomes clear, right, what the regulatory framework is going to be, right, you will find that the mark-to-market is going to start to happen.
Okay.
And you and I can buy a New York skyscraper for 25 cents on the dollar.
Okay. Paul, do you want to say anything briefly?
Which is why Paul is going back.
I better get my checkbook ready.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, again, not much to add. I mean, hats off to Jesper. I don't predict foreign exchange rates, but I was on a panel with Jesper a year ago or so, whenever it was, and I think the yen was 150, 120, and he said it's going to 150 and beyond. So, hats off to Jesper with his foreign exchange forecasting. I'm not that brave or that clever when it comes to exchange rates. But just to tie a couple of points together. I mean, I really liked Jesper talking about and sort of updating me on the developments around corporate governance and the change in the culture at the top of corporate Japan and the focus on I won't call it shareholder value, but you know what I'm talking about, return on equity and efficient management of corporate assets. And then the story about Seven and I as well, see how that plays out. I published a book in 2000 in Japanese called Kigyo Mega Saihen from Toyo Keizai Shimposha. So I've been talking about this issue for a long time, and I still kind of bit of a broken record, but if you look at the last 30 years, I mean, this didn't all start with the corporate governance code or the stewardship code, as useful as those things were. Japan has, particularly in the 1990s and beyond that, undergone a revolution in terms of the toolkit that is available to management to manage corporate assets, introduction of holding companies, introduction of share buybacks, holding treasury stock, being able to manage your capital structure more efficiently, moving from parent accounting to consolidated accounting, the deregulation opening up and growth of the asset management industry, and this secular change over the last 35 years where arm's length investors have taken over as the majority from the internal so-called stable shareholders, ante kabanushi, etc. So all the ingredients are in place for a much more active market for corporate control. And then, of course, but one of the blockages to that, and again, this goes back to my PhD thesis in the 1980s, is that the capital market arrangements, the corporate organization arrangements that we characterized Japan in the post-war period were supported by the employment system.
Right.
So if you like, you didn't have liquidity in the market of corporate control, you didn't have liquidity in the labor markets. And Japan, I think, is moving to a system where liquidity in both is increasing. And that is one of the we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to lose the benefits that Japan has from many of these things. But that is part of the formula for moving towards more efficient utilization of assets. Exactly. And that will generate the resources, the productivity that the aging population needs, etc. What's all that got to do with the exchange rate, Kurt, is that if we do move into an era now of mega corporate restructuring, as I titled my book in 2000, maybe 2 or 3 decades too early, that is going to change the calculus around the attractiveness of the yen, that we'll see much more money coming into Japan wanting to be part of that process. Linking back to also one other of Jesper's points about the importance now of this national security agendas driving economic policy making. I think what Jesper was saying is that Japan should be in pole position, being the key part of the alliance. If you're Japan, you're on the right side of this equation. But that's perhaps, there are some nuances there that are difficult to navigate. But one of the obvious things for Japan to do, and corporate Japan to do, is to and there's a bit of a nuance a shift between Harris and Trump on this issue. I think the Democrats and maybe the establishment Republicans are much more focused on national security issues and concerns about ascendancy of China. I think Trump is more simple, and he's much more focused on jobs and the hollowing out. Right. So again, if Trump were to win, I think he is amenable to the U.S. I can't speak for him, but my guess is that he would be amenable, pardon me, to the Nippon Steel, US Steel deal going through, if it was structured in the right way. If you could just sit down and explain to him, this is all about American jobs.
Yeah.
So the more that Japan can sort of work that angle, the better. But unfortunately, the exchange rate is not too helpful in that regard, because if the yen was stronger, there'd be a stronger case for Japanese corporations to be investing more. But Japan has a labor shortage. It's not going away with the aging of society. The immigration reforms that I might like to see will probably not deal with that. So Japan needs to take its technology and its management prowess to the workers and to where the market is, which is to a large extent in the US. And again, that will play into the exchange rate.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Yes, okay. Go to the microphone, please. Identify yourself. And
Come in. I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to sneak out. Okay.
Okay.
Great seeing you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll
Okay.
answer on your behalf.
Okay. You answer.
Thank you.
When in doubt, it's 200.
Thank you, Jesper, for your contribution.
Thank you.
Okay.
What do you feel will be impact on China should Mr. Trump win?
Oh, well, he's talking very tough on China. It'll be interesting, but again, I think maybe I'm too optimistic with these issues. But what Trump, he likes to talk. He likes to he brags a lot about the great relations that he has with Xi Jinping, or even Kim Jong-un, or obviously Shinzo Abe, the late Shinzo Abe. His way of implementing economic policy and national security policy is, I'm a businessman. I cut deals. I sit down and talk with people. So, pardon me. He'll talk very tough. He'll threaten tariffs, etc. But I think his inclination will be not to hole himself up in the White House, but to get on the phone and perhaps at an early stage actually have a summit with Xi Jinping. And who knows what might come out of that. But my more optimistic side of me would say we might go back, potentially. There might be a bit of a circuit breaker here. We would go back to, Xi Jinping, what do you need? What is your beef? This is what I need. Can we cut a deal here? And so I'm not, again, as quite concerned about, on the economic front, a big further schism opening up. On the national security side of things, again, I think Trump is very interesting from the viewpoint, maybe harking back to one of Jesper's points before he talked about American leadership. Again, you have to read into Trump's rhetoric what he might be kind of thinking. It's not always obvious, but when you look, the way that I interpreted Trump Mark I, which was "Make America Great Again, America First," it was in some sense saying, essentially Trump saying, why do we, America, have to be the policeman to the world? Why are we protecting all of these allies? Why are we're the most powerful country in the world, got the biggest economy, most dynamic economy, but in his eyes, in his mind, he thinks the US is being ripped off. So that is, my interpretation of this was that the era of sort of Pax Americana is kind of coming to an end here. China, on a PPP basis, is now about 20% of global GDP, PPP, purchasing power parity. The US is about 15%. Now, China's having some wobbles, and it'll run into demographic headwinds, pardon me. But if you think that China is going to continue to grow at 3, 4, 5% over a sustained period, somewhere in that range, at least 3%, above the potential growth rate in the US, which is reckoned to be more around 2%, if not a little bit less, China's going to become more and more important, pardon me, in the world. Talking too much here. And so that I think is where Trump has a potentially different view from not just the Democrats, but from the Republicans as well, where you have more of an appetite to say, no, US has to maintain global leadership. We have to build alliances. We have to be the country that the world looks to for its leadership. I think Donald Trump will sort of say, well, hold on a minute. What does that mean? How much is that going to cost me? How much is that going to cost America? So again, I think under Harris, I think the kind of national security agenda, relationship with China, Taiwan issue, Ukraine, NATO expansion, all of that stuff will kind of be business as usual. I think under Trump, there may be changes that even Donald Trump himself can't articulate, but maybe we move in a slightly different direction. More uncertainty, more potential volatility, but it could be more delta, more change in the way in which US relates to China and Russia for that matter as well.
That is extremely interesting. Sorry, Wayne, could you just, am I missing any questions online? Could you tell me, please? Sorry, just a minute. I'm not, okay. Well, you've had one question. You want to follow? You want clarification quickly? You're happy, okay. More questions in the room. I would just like to note, I mean, I thought Jesper's...
May I ask my question?
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I mean, you take it... oh, sorry again, yeah. Today's fantastic information and so on is great, absolutely, and make you open your face. But I feel that you're a little bit on the side already that Trump has already made it. And so what happens if he doesn't make it? What will that be different, well, with him being there and, not the rest of the world is great, happy with Trump taking over. Thank you.
Right. Pardon me again. Well, I think it's sort of more interesting to talk about what the scenario when if Trump wins, because there's more likely to be things happening that are kind of different from the existing situation. I think if Harris were to win, probably if Harris wins, the Democrats will probably take the House as well. Not the Senate. I think the Senate will probably go to the Republicans, but a very thin margin, maybe 51-49, something like that. They look like they'll pick up 2 seats in the Senate at least, West Virginia and Montana. But I think a Harris presidency will be, it's really continuity in all of these issues. I don't think, and there is again another difference between Trump and Harris as candidates and therefore as potential presidents. I think Kamala Harris is much more of a party machine person. Mm-hmm. So her presidency would be more of a figurehead, more of a front woman, a spokesperson. She would not herself be driving an agenda. So I think the kind of the Democrat Party agenda, the establishment, the national security community, that agenda would move forward. On the social side, perhaps more of a kind of progressive agenda and the sort of things that we've seen, which sometimes are described as kind of wokeism, will probably continue as well. The one thing we haven't really talked about, but was something that Jesper touched on, is the division in American society. And there is a possibility, particularly if the election is very close, that there's turmoil in the wake of the election. Mm. And we don't quite know what's going to happen between November 5th and January 20th. Mm. And we saw shades of that in 2016. We saw obviously shades of it in 2020 in a different way. But those divisions and the hyperpartisanship and the wounds that have been created in the polity in the US between, if you like, the coastal elites, which are largely Democrat supporters, and the kind of MAGA Republicans, the Trump followers, that are very much concentrated in the industrial heartland and parts of the South. If there is a very, I think what would be best for the country would be a clear-cut election result either way. The worst-case scenario will be probably if Trump wins wins or loses in a very narrow margin. It'll be a tricky couple of months to get to the inauguration. There's all kinds of complications in the electoral college system. For example, maybe just take 30 seconds on this. Sure. There's a concept called faithless electors, which means that what you're voting for in the presidential election is, well, Trump versus Harris, but you're really voting for electoral college voters in that state, a Republican slate and a Democrat slate. And wasn't so bad in 2020, but in 2016 there was something like 7 electoral college voters that didn't vote the way they were supposed to. And if it's a very close election, you only need a few of those electoral college voters to say, oh, whatever, I'm not going to vote for the candidate that I'm supposed to vote for because, for reason X, Y, or Z. And you have a constitutional crisis. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but be prepared potentially in the short term for a rather kind of rocky ride.
Interesting. Okay. Actually, related to that, Jesper, and I'm paraphrasing him, mentioned the view among the elites, I think he said in America, questioning some of the value of the US-Japan relationship. He also talked about the fact that Japanese exports have not been picking up partly because of US sanctions and so on. So I don't know whether you feel able to talk about this, but to what extent are Japanese business people becoming disenchanted with the impact that US policies are having, US sanctions, if you like, or policies are having on Japanese exports, for instance, and therefore that will influence their attitude towards the US-Japan relationship?
I don't have particular insight into that. That's probably a better question for Jesper, who's talking to those people on a closer basis. But just to make a comment on that, picking up on that point, is that whichever candidate does win, it will be very important for Japan, for the Japanese Prime Minister and the administration, to have a very good channel of communication and build a good relationship. And I'm thinking here of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, and famously in 2016 he flew to New York. He met Donald Trump in Trump Tower. And one of the things that you might get a little bit worried about is if we have this political turmoil in Japan continue, and politics becomes very kind of inward-looking and parochial. Meanwhile, we have a presidential outcome and some potentially major changes developing. Japan will need to make sure that its voice is being heard and being heard in the right way. So that is a worry. But I think, given the strength of the U.S. alliance, Japan is in a good position. And there's another. I've sort of kind of identified in my own mind 3 areas where corporate Japan is kind of potentially well placed. We've talked about industrial policy, not just corporate Japan, but administrative Japan. Japan kind of invented industrial policy. So Japan, again, should be, Japan, whether it's corporate Japan, whether it's METI, whether it's the political leaders, should be inside that conversation. They understand the parameters. They've done this themselves, and it's almost like the rest of the world has come towards them. The second issue, which is a little bit like that, is global supply chain management, and all this discussion we have around resilience of supply chains, and this obviously intersects with national security issues as well. Well, Japan, again, has done global supply chain management for decades. It's called general trading companies. And the big general trading companies are still around, and they're still doing what they do, which is innovate and get inside, and intermediate transactions, provide capital, provide know-how, and link information. So as this supply chain resilience issue and nearshoring and offshoring, etc., and diversification of supply chains, of course, talk supply chains, think of Toyota, and think of the auto industry, supply chain management. Jesper mentioned the convenience stores.
Yep.
That's also about supply chain management. So Japan's got tremendous expertise in this area, and again, I think should be kind of selling its software, so to speak, in the US arena as well, software in a quote unquote, be part of that conversation, and point out why Japan is well placed to help remediate some of these challenges around supply side management. And then the third one I'd point out is sort of been touched upon in some of the discussion is, in the last 5 to 10 years in particular, we've seen this shift in the US towards ESG, environmental social governance, DEI, maybe the pendulum swinging a little bit away from that now, diversity, equity, inclusion, corporate social responsibility, etc. And then this idea of stakeholder capitalism. The Business Roundtable put out a famous statement, I think it was 2019, and the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, has pushed this idea of stakeholder capitalism. Well, again, Japan kind of invented stakeholder capitalism and has been trying to kind of evolve. So that's another kind of area where the softer, rather than sort of Japan looking at these things and saying, how do we adapt to that? Being a little bit more proactive and saying, well, hey, hold on a minute. We know a lot about this stuff. This is the way we do it. We want to be part of the conversation.
That's fascinating. I mean, do you think either which of the two, Trump or Harris, will be more receptive to listening to Japan on these, imbibing Japanese wisdom, if you like, on things like industrial policy?
Well, it's hard to say, and I don't, but I think that one I mentioned was actually had a talk in New York before I flew to Japan this time, a couple of weeks ago, and the issue of US steel and Nippon Steel came up. And, again, Donald Trump is a very transactional person, and he's very, and also the personal level. He likes to be liked, he likes to be popular. He likes to brag about, he sat down with X, and we cut a deal and we got on together and we're the best friends in the world. So I think that on that US steel issue, for example, saying to Donald Trump, somebody on the Japan side, look, we are one of your greatest allies. That alliance goes back to the 1960 UMPO treaty. And who cut that treaty? Well, Shinzo Abe's grandfather.
Oh, really?
And Kishi Nobusuke. And so kind of I say playing that card, but kind of putting this in a context of saying, look, if you're worried about national security issues, you don't need to worry about Japan. If you're worried about employment issues, you don't need to worry about that. We're not China, and so we can be treated in we can be inside that small yard, high fence that has been Jesper referenced. I think Jake Sullivan may have used that term. And so, again, in some ways, I think Trump may be easier to convince if you can get his attention and make the right pitch, because he is more prepared to take kind of I'll do that, and I've got the power to do it.
Okay.
With Harris, it's going to be much more. Again, you're coming up against more of the Democrat establishment. You're probably going to need to work more through DC lobbyists and influencers like that, and work the more traditional process.
Okay. So Warren Buffett was right then to buy shares in Sogo Shoshu. Okay, we've just got...
I hope so. He saw
we've got
something.
time for one more question, quickly, if there's a question from the floor or anyone online. If not, it is 2 minutes before. Yes. Well, all right, one quick question then. Sorry.
Well, I think
Mike.
next year, again. The World Exposition in Osaka next year is going to be a fantastic thing. And I think it will be a great basis to change. I tell you because I was there in 1970 for the last Osaka World Exposition. And this was a huge thing from outside going into. I'm sure that next year it's going to be a great change in the going outside, and that can be a great thing for Japan as a whole.
Yeah, no, it's correct. I think that's a very good point, and I think you can broaden it out to Japan is experiencing this tourism boom, obviously the last couple of years, and I think there's a great opportunity that every time a foreigner sets foot in Japan, Japan has an opportunity to build its brand in the world. And the one thing that worries me a little bit with getting back to the exchange rate question is, exchange rates are market determined, and governments don't control exchange rates. Central banks maybe influence, but don't determine exchange rates. But they are a bit of a barometer of how attractive the country is in the world. And Japan's sort of ability to draw on the rest of the world's resources has declined because of the weakening of the exchange rate, call it the terms of trade effect or whatever. And anything that, and so the flip side of that is to say that the great assets that Japan has, and just, I spend a week in Tokyo and I'm just in awe as I go around the infrastructure and everything else, the food and everything that works so well. The weaker exchange rate is also a measure of the amount of interest there is and demand there is outside of Japan for the things that you can buy and experience in Japan. So I do think the expo, as well as tourism more generally, Japan shouldn't just treat these people, they came, they stayed, they left, but somehow try to engage with them as well. If 100 tourists come to Japan or 100 tourists come to visit the expo, and 1 or 2 of them or 3 of them get interested in Japan and say, wow, I wouldn't mind actually maybe living here a month a year or whatever, coming back, there are there are sort of commercial and business opportunities that can come about simply because of those people coming to Japan and experiencing and realizing, wow, this is really, I always say to Japanese people who come to Japan for the first time, you're lucky. Japan is sui generis. There's nothing like it in the world, and you're going to love it. So I think that's another opportunity for Japan.
Okay, well, Paul, thank you very much indeed for holding the fort for so long. And it really is nice to have you in the room, I must say. I always prefer to have speakers in the room if possible. Thank you, Jesper, although you're not here, for your lively contributions. I think we've covered a lot of ground and, as usual, only scratched the surface of what is a fascinating debate. We're going to be hearing a lot more of this debate in coming days. So please join me, everyone, in thanking our speakers. And we have, Wayne, do we have an honorary membership for Paul? Yes, we do.
Thank you.
So I'll present you later with an honorary membership. But thank you very much indeed. And we hope we'll see you again very shortly.
Thank you.
Bon voyage back to the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.